Anarchism as a practice, an organised society that functions without hierarchical authority, has existed for tens of thousands of years. And while we see advocates of non-hierarchically organised social systems in the works of early Taoists, radical Christians and Stoics, it wasn't until the late 1700s that Western anarchism starts to take on a form resembling a distinct political doctrine. Not the first advocate of such a position, Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin is certainly one of anarchism's more vocal proponents. Quote, "If there is a state, there must be domination of one class by another, and, as a result, slavery. The state without slavery is unthinkable, and this is why we are the enemies of the state." Born into Russian nobility in 1814, by 1866, Bakunin had been on death row, exiled, imprisoned and tortured. His early left-wing pan-Slavic nationalism had somewhat abated, producing a more distinct social anarchist flavour. He was a militant activist and a participant in the revolutions that spread through Europe in 1848. A wave of revolts arguably unparalleled in European history. A contemporary and antagonist of Karl Marx, Bakunin was a leading theorist and practitioner of collectivist or social anarchism. He was an activist and theorist, but let's be absolutely clear about this, his work uses overtly gendered language and elsewhere, I believe, is deeply anti-Semitic. It has been fiercely criticised by anarchists on these grounds. Bakunin's critique of Rousseau's theory of the state, as it became to be known, was originally presented as part of a speech Bakunin gave at the first General Congress of the International Working Men's Association, or the First International, held in Geneva, Switzerland in 1866, and the excerpts were later published in 1867. This was a significant forum aimed to unite different working class organisations, and it was at this meeting that Western socialists declared a position for the universal establishment of the 8-hour working day. And it was here where Bakunin stood up and launched a scathing, emotive and historically significant speech denouncing one of the articles of faith of politics and IR. That is, the necessity of the state. In his words, the most flagrant, the most cynical, and the most complete negation of humanity. In critique of Rousseau's theory of the state, Bakunin argues that states, a specific way of organising political communities, will always be in conflict with another because that is the nature of states, to protect themselves or face annihilation. The people within these states, the sovereign, the government, they have little choice but to behave in this aggressive anti-humanist way. He says, every state must devour lest it be devoured, conquer lest it be conquered, enslave lest it be enslaved. And this is a huge issue for Bakunin in that the state's survival is given more value and significance than humanity itself. By placing people within these artificially constructed state boundaries, what you are doing, for Bakunin, is severely privileging those within that state, those citizens, at the expense of others who are located physically and legally outside of those borders. One of his major issues is that while a state might sometimes extend human rights and a civilised approach to humanity to people within its borders, at the same time, well, if you are outside these borders, states think that they have every right to treat you with ferocious inhumanity. You will be plundered, exterminated, and enslaved at will. Why? Because Bakunin reckons that it is a state's supreme duty and greatest virtue to do whatever it must in order to protect itself. There is no higher value within a state system than of patriotism. And how does patriotism manifest? In the violence towards others that come into conflict with your state. States, statism, the system which dominates contemporary political formations privileges the state over humanity. And it leads to an anything goes in the name of the state mentality. Bakunin is saying that you have these acts that would otherwise be a crime, but when done in the interest of the state, they're okay. So he says that to, quote, offend, oppress, to despoil, to plunder, to assassinate or enslave, they are kind of agreed upon bad things for the most part. But then if you do it in the name of your state, it suddenly switches to being the most glorious thing you can do. Because you are a patriot, you are virtuous, you are fulfilling your duty as a citizen to no less protect and preserve your state. So you can see what he's getting at here. We might say that carpet bombing a people is not a good thing, but then put your state sticker over the bombs and create a narrative that suggests you were duty bound to do it because you were protecting your state. Well, then you become a hero, a patriotic warrior. Now, for some states, Bakunin acknowledges, they might show some humanity towards a conquered or governed population. They don't have to always plunder and exterminate. But this is not because of international law or any rubbish like that, he says, but because it makes sense politically to do so. It does not come from a sense of duty to other humans. Since the birth of states, Bakunin goes on, this sort of cruelty has been ever present. And patriotism has been used to justify some of the most horrific acts in recent history. And for this behaviour, protect the state at all costs, there is no higher glory. Instead, and articulated in his other works, Bakunin appeals to a justice, to a power source derived not from God and not from the state, but from humanity. He believes in the rights of people, in the dignity and necessity of the human species, and believes states are fundamentally unable to provide such rights. In this work, he is also having a go at Jean-Jacques Rousseau and other social contract theorists. While they may share agreement that people have been tricked into coming together in a modern state form, tricked by the rich and powerful as a way of maintaining their own riches and power, Bakunin disagrees that any state, however well-intentioned, can ever be beneficial to humanity as a whole. So while social contract theorists might say there is a good when people come together, giving up a little bit of their liberty in order to have other rights protected in the process, Bakunin is saying that while it may be fine for the people that agree to this contract, those outside of this contract are in serious, serious trouble. So, in a way, he's kind of agreeing with Hobbes, or at least the ways in which realist international relations scholars have applied Hobbes. Crudely, states cannot rely on anyone or anything other than themselves and need to be ruthless because other states are behaving the same way. But Bakunin critically disagrees with Hobbes' idea that pre-state life was necessarily brutal and that the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. Bakunin's attitude to human nature is complex, but broadly, he sees human nature as constructed and dependent on external circumstances and individual choices. And for Bakunin, when humans are put into these constrained relationships bound by the state, where the state's survival is the ultimate social goal, then it is not surprising that the sovereign or the government behave in extremely cruel ways to people that are outside of the state's boundaries. Cue torture, enslavement, and genocide. I find this scholarship so interesting because for me, it challenges and deeply problematizes foundational narratives of polls and IR regarding the state. It attempts to relocate power and autonomy firmly back in the hands of individuals and collectives. And while Bakunin wasn't the first to say it or even feel it, he was one of the more vocal advocates of this narrative. I was taught at school and at uni that people came together to form states so they could better deal with their external troubles as a whole, to fend off invading hordes. And they did this by actively selecting hierarchical structures to produce a better result. But maybe this is a foundational myth. Indeed, there is a rich body of scholarship now by academics like Pierre Clastres, James C. Scott, and Peter Gelderloos, and others, who appear to discredit this foundational narrative, highlighting instead stories of massive resistance to early state formation and the existence of stateless, fully functioning societies with large populations. Maybe states are not the be-all and end-all of organising political, social and cultural communities. In my travels, in my research, and in my ethnographies, and in my communications with social movement activists, militants, community organisers, Indigenous peoples and others, I have learned of other forms of social organising by communities who have chosen to live without overarching state authority and hierarchies. There are radical, active projects of social organisation premised on liberty, autonomy and respect in operation in North and South America, Latin America, Africa, in Asia, Europe and the Pacific. Examples of the reconfiguration of power relationships within contemporary society.